Welcome to our fourth session, Grids of Biology and Technology. The next two lectures examine bio-inspired mechanisms in highly composed and variegated environments. They deal with macro-scale and micro-scale coordination processes and communication strategies while looking at both the natural and the man-made worlds. The examination of both natural and human technological systems is made through understanding the rationale behind these systems, their generative mechanisms, and inherent vitalism. In this way, we can benefit from the special insight of the speakers, which reveals before us some key philosophical problematics. Our first speaker, Sayfan Borghini, Italian-born, has an MSc in physics and a PhD from the University of Rome, concentrating on the structural behavior of complex biomolecule. Her multidisciplinary expertise includes biophysics and complexity, bio-inspired design, and urban ecology. That's pretty diverse. Sayfan is a member of the MD's department, as well as a lecturer at the master's program in integrated design and HIT. She's one of the founding members and currently lectures at the Postgraduate International School of Thinking at the Vrije University of Brussels, where she's affiliated with the Evolution, Complexity, and Cognition Research Group, the ECCO. She has been a researcher in a number of European-wide projects, like the interdisciplinary Tempus Idea European project. As part of her research, she took part both in the curation and as a scientific advisor in exhibitions exploring novel human-machine interactions and biodesign. So let us welcome Dr. Sayfan Borghini. Hello. Just to make sure.
The grid from the lenses of biomimicry. Biomimicry is a relatively new discipline that takes its name from bios, life, mimesis, imitation. So it can be looked at as well as bio-inspired design, and as a discipline that learns to look at nature to find intelligent solutions. I situate this discipline in between or in the intersection between science and design, where science is the expert in constructing and validating new theories, while design brings the expertise of innovation and validation of the effectiveness of artifacts. And biomimicry is in between. And we can see we have the hard science and we have all the disciplines through which we modify and engineer our environments, generating further complexity. So while looking at the grid in the biological world, we do not really find the grid that we saw in architecture or in the computer science. But one thing which is ubiquitous in biology is networks at all possible scales. So I will look at the grid in two main aspects. One as infrastructure, and I will elaborate, and the second one as connectivity. I wish to begin from another metaphor. This is the image of the tree of life, which is a metaphor that tells us about how life evolved from a first ancestral, common ancestor, and evolved within these connections, which are genetic interconnectedness between all the previous ancestors. It is also a huge collective study of all the scientists that gathered and compiled the data. And this is a particular representation, very new. It's available on the Evolutionary website. And the reason why I very much like it, it's because it shows us what evolution has performed, which is to create this front wave, which is a complete front wave of evolution in which we appear just at the very end. So when we look at the evolved organism today, we know that the strategies and the organisms that these survive are well adapted. And what this means that they are most probably highly tested and specialized for the functional niche in which they belong. Importantly, another aspect which is not so much emphasized, but it should, is that all of these strategies and the organism that perform them are actually interlinked in networks, which we can call ecosystems. And these networks and their tight connectivity allows to create environments in which the only one renewable source of energy, which is sunlight, can be absorbed, transformed into biomass, transferred among different organisms, and on the way it produces different environments and impressive number and variety of species. So again, these are the networks that support life, because these are the networks that are able to take energy and to transform it and to terraform where we live. So in this sense, though we like to say that we live on the planet, we don't really live on the planet. We live in the ecosystems and the environments that life created and is maintaining actively in order to make it conducive to life. Without this type of environment, there's no us on this planet. And I wish to go a bit deeper in this idea of these networks as the infrastructure of life. So this is a study from 2018, and this specifically, it's the graphic representation that was done on the basis of the data of this study, which measured or speculatively measured the weight of all life on Earth. I think that there is something very interesting in the proportion. We can clearly see that the biggest amount is plants. And it makes sense because plants are the photosynthetic organism. And after that, we have a lot of very small unicellular organisms, bacteria, fungi, algae, protists. And we have to go all the way to the right in these two small gray cubes to have the animals, the so-called complex animals. And we are the even smaller red brick on top of it. And now, if I detail within all the animals across this graph, you can see that, again, the greatest majority of it's insects. So we see that the proportion is with all of these organisms that are good at dismantling. They are a part of the decay process and the recycling of all kinds of resources which are finite on our planet, like minerals, like water, like gases. So another interesting point is that if we look not at the quantity, but the variety, which means how many species there are in a particular domain of life, we see that the greatest variety is among bacteria. So again, the kind of complexity that we are used to place at the top of what was the tree of life suddenly appears as well at the bottom. Now what I'm going to do, it's a form of first impression, and I will try to take what are the basic design principles if we would want to apply them to this multidisciplinary grid and make it sustainable and that it will support our collective coordination. So first of all, we have an issue of proportion, and we see that we have a greatest amount, which means the invested quantitative growth has to do with all the organisms that can extract and store renewable energy, while the greatest diversity, which means novelty, qualitative growth, is invested in decomposers and recyclers. So we have these complex chains of metabolic process which are very strongly represented within the proportion. The other important line, as is written on the top, is that all of this enters kind of cycles because the resources apart from sunlight are finite on the planet. So life is recycling them for almost 4 billion years, which is quite a scale in time, and somehow it succeeded. Sorry, it didn't work. And as I said before, complexity is found both at the bottom and at the top. And another interesting observation, which is correlated to the cycles, is that actually waste does not exist. Waste, it's an artificial concept that appears the moment we extract the unit from its metabolic cycle. But somehow we have extracted ourselves from the metabolic cycles. This is just an example of a project that was done by students in the course of biomimicry. They were impacted by this idea of how our impact on the planet might be changing the composition of the atmosphere, so rendering oxygen scarce. And what you see here, it's actually a vest, which is constructed of small terrarium, which contain live moss and live alga, and are supposed to produce oxygen, which we can breathe in while walking in the sun. So, but let's say that we wish this kind of collective coordination. Now, how would it happen? Does it have a manager? Does it have a control room? Is it something which is centralized? The little that I will say is, first of all, that collective coordination happens in nature much more than we would expect. We know that social intelligence evolved a number of times. Here you have the example of bees, and we have ants and termites, we have bacteria. But I will just give two short examples from the extreme of the scale. So, bacteria. Bacteria is a very simple unicellular organism. We expect them to go around on their own. Yet we know by now that under stress, they suddenly show colony-like behavior, which means they become extremely social. And they suddenly form highly structured networks, which contain millions of milliards of bacteria each. And they are extremely competent in the sense that they can solve problems which the single bacteria would die of. Here you can see more structure. So, for example, biofilms are a type of this kind of colony. We all know them very well. Whenever you find something that it's slimy, there is probably a biofilm of bacteria involved. So they are a kind of structured matrix, which is extruded by the bacteria, but it provides a very protected mode of growth for the colony, so they can suddenly resist toxins which would kill them, like antibiotics. And interestingly, it contains hundreds of species sometimes. It's not only one bacteria. They open this cooperative environment to multiple genetic species. Which is against what we might have thought. So here we see an example from a study that was done by the laboratory of Professor Eshel Ben Yaakov in Tel Aviv University. This is one type of bacteria to the left, the Penobacillus, which is able somehow, when it forms colony, to select between different strategies. They are very different shapes, but they are actually defined by the kind of substrata that it is grown upon. And this selection is something that we would not expect from a creature as simple as a bacteria. This is from a project that we did together with the artist Nurit Barshai and in collaboration with the master program here at HIT. And the laboratory of Professor Eshel Ben Yaakov, in which the students were given the task to imagine different Petri dish which have not only a flat and round structure, but they do have a kind of architecture, internal in the shape of the substrata, and external in the shape of the Petri dish. And then they were placed in an exhibition, and indeed they show differences which should be studied more in depth. So we have seen that they have this kind of super talent or superpower that we don't expect, but in some fashion they need to coordinate. So how do they speak? Speak, of course, is not a language. So one thing that we know is that they coordinate. There is a process which is named Quorum Sensing, in which bacteria on their own, when they are in the unicellular form, constantly release molecules in the environment. And when the amount of the molecules reach a certain quorum, then they know that there is enough of them to switch mode. And this switch mode might be becoming luminescent, or becoming a full infection of a bigger organism, or becoming a biofilm. So interestingly enough, we see that in this very simple organism that had to survive for billions of years, there is a memory which is external to the organism. It's in the environment. And probably the decision-making is also happening through this quorum sensing in the outside environment. It is embedded in the structure between them, so the grid. The other process is that they exchange between them. So when they form a biofilm, they do connection between different species and different metabolic processes in order to transform the toxin and to share the nutrients. So cooperation pays off, because this is the big question. When we speak of evolution, we always have this idea in mind of the selfish reproductive selected winner. While here what we see is something which is extremely networked and with a very high level of cooperation. But the reason is that cooperation actually pays off in terms of information and prediction of how the environment will work. And they have another aspect which is even more impressive. They can connect when they are in these colonies, they can connect to each other and share their innards. They are swapping genes. And this is how they edit genes, and they can push mutations. So they are here to get us in some fashion. So which are, again, the design principles that we can take for our grid? Well, the first one is this idea of the environment as something that can mediate messaging. So there is this distributed memory, which is in between, and some inbuilt process of decision-making, like the quorum sensing. The other one is that these spatially structured interaction networks, which mean the grid as infrastructure, allows this dilution of toxins and this sharing of nutrients. They actually organize themselves in layers so that they each one takes a stage in the metabolic aspect. They do share information in a very wide fashion, even swapping their source code. So they swapping of the source code is something which is quite intimate, if at all we can say it. So we can speak of this connectivity. And they have this ability to transform themselves. If they are individual, let's say they are disciplinary, they are part of one species, so they operate in a certain fashion. And when they come within the colony to operate as a social or to operate as multidisciplinary, if we want to push the metaphor, so they transform, they switch on modules that can do that. So in this, we see that cooperation is not about being part of the same species or having the same genetics, but it's about interoperability. And this might be something that we need to focus ourselves on in the coming years of research and development of multidisciplinary. This is the second example that I would like to present, which is on the very other extreme of the scale, because we're speaking of forests and we're speaking of plants. So when we look at plants, like the seedling here, the first thing that we think about them is that they are inert, they are passive, they can do nothing other than grow, they cannot move, they cannot respond. So, but actually we now know that along the eons, plants developed a surprising symbiotic alliance with nothing else than mushrooms. It's not exactly the mushrooms, it's the mycelia, which is the vegetative body underground. But we know now that mycelia colonize almost 90% of existing plants. And together, as you can see in the image to the right, it is as if it is extending the roots. So somehow there is a mutual alliance that probably is not parasitic, but provides advantages. So mycelia, differently from the tree, which grows a centralized network of roots, mycelia, it's a rhizomatic network. It grows very fast, and it can eat itself back when it's not enough, when it doesn't need that part anymore. So it's very fast in branching and taking over large areas. So it's a fast exploiting. So we understand that there must be an exchange system between the trees and the mushroom. And we also understand why. The mushroom is photosynthetic. No, the tree is photosynthetic, so it produces sugar, while the mushroom is not. So the mushroom is receiving the sugar, and the trees are receiving the kind of minerals that they cannot produce, like nitrogen and phosphorus, which the mushroom produces by decomposing what is on the ground of the forest. But this is not all. In a very famous study of Professor Simard at the end of the 20th century, so it was discovered that actually the trees use this mushroom network to shuttle carbon between trees. And it was seen that if there are big old trees, they are kind of sending carbon to the small seedlings, which are now growing in a very dark forest, so they cannot perform photosynthesis, and they are missing sugar. So what we are speaking here, it's almost a wood wide web. This is not mine, it's a Paul Stammet, a specialist in mushrooms. So there is this huge web, which can be at times as big as the forest. And actually there are some of these mycelia that have been measured, and they are large, a few square kilometers, and they are old for thousands of years. So we are actually speaking of probably the biggest and oldest organism on the planet, which is in contrast with what we thought in the beginning, something which is inert and passive. So what are the design principles that we can take from here? So we have these invested centralized hubs that are together with this fast distributed network, and the architecture at large is quite distributed, though with hubs. We have, again, these exchanges that are, actually they are the motive behind the production of this spatially structured network, so the infrastructure again. And this presents, actually once we look from the forest all the way to the interface between the mycelia and the tree, we find something interesting, which means there is structures at each scale, from the kilometer to the millimeter. And this allows fast adaptation, fast regeneration, because everything can be modular and everything can be separated and regenerated. And again, what we have seen before, the grid-less connectivity in terms of sharing information and an interoperability between hundreds, if not thousands, of species. So to conclude, with this idea of turning to nature for good design, it is a way that we can reapprehend nature, but it's also a way for us to integrate between this science, which investigate and produce predictions, and this more design-like discipline, which are generating complexity. They enter, step in the complexity, and they generate it. And it's important that both the models will be available to practice, and that practice will provide grounds with context for theory. It is important because this might allow us, one of the probably important aspect of this era, which is the need to reconstruct value and unify it across the board. If we would have continued to look at the tree of life the way it was depicted in the 19th century, with the age of man on top and all the rest just small branches, probably all what we have discussed in this lecture wouldn't have come to mind. Thank you. Could you take inspiration from swarms of birds and insects and the way they communicate between them to imagine the future of mobility? This is what a student from the Master in Design did in our course.
האם תוכלו לבנות מערך שכולו מבוסס על העקרונות שסוריקטות מלמדות את הצאצאים שלהם איך לאכול עקרבים ארסיים? זה מתוך העבודה של סטודנט לטכנולוגיית למידה אצלנו.
Could you look at the structure of a leaf in order to better understand the networks of infrastructure in a city? This is the work of one of our students from the Faculty of Design.
האם תוכלו לבנות מערכת לחישוב מקבילי יותר טובה, יותר יעילה ויותר יציבה מאלה שיש היום? פה אנחנו רואים עבודה של סטודנט שלנו משנה ג' שבנה מערכת כזו שכולה מבוססת על העקרונות של איך להעביר מזון ואינפורמציה אצל פטריות.
Do you think we will grow shoes in the future? Here is a project from a team of students from design.
האם תוכלו לבנות מתקן שאוגר מים מעל החוט שבאוויר ואת כל העקרונות של המתקן הזה לבסס על המבנה הננומטרי של חיפושיות? פה אתם רואים עבודה של סטודנטית שלנו מחילופי סטודנטים שהגיעה מהודו.
Hello, I'm Sayfan Borghini.
נעים מאוד, קוראים לי אלעד סגב, ויחד אנחנו מעבירים את הקורס בביומימיקרי. מה זה בעצם ביומימיקרי? הרעיון העיקרי שעומד מאחורי תחום הביומימיקרי הוא שצמחים ובעלי חיים בטבע קיימים כבר למעלה מ3.5 מיליארד שנים. במהלך כל השנים האלה התפתח מגוון פתרונות אדיר לבעיות של תקשורת, אנרגיה ויצירת מבנים יציבים. כל הפתרונות ששרדו את האבולוציה הם כאלה שמאפשרים התמודדות עם תקלות ושינויים. הם חסכוניים באנרגיה, והכי מפתיע, הם לא יוצרים פסולת או בזבוז של משאבים.
Biomimicry is a multidisciplinary approach that studies the best designs found in nature and attempts to adapt them in order to create objects, processes, systems, and strategies which are both efficient and sustainable. In the course, we study the logic according to which they operate and in which way it differs from human technology and productions.
הקורס הזה כולו מבוסס על זה שלומדים מתוך עשייה ועבודה על פרויקטים. במהלך הקורס נערוך ניסויים ותצפיות במערכות ביולוגיות, וכל אחד יפתח את אחד הניסויים לידי מיני פרויקט שמעניין אותו. בסוף, כל סטודנט או זוג סטודנטים יעבדו על פרויקט סיום שלהם, בדומה לאלה שהוצגו בתחילת הסרטון. אנחנו מצפים לראות אתכם בקורס הבא שלנו. ביי ביי.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sayfan Borghini. Thank you very much.